didn't happen. It's interesting, the people after the war who went back to Poland, there are all kinds of terrible stories about one of the times in Kielce, there was a pogrom, like the Jews that came back from the concentration camps. I think it was in 1946, right? When they came back, the neighbors massacred them. Right? Imagine, like if things had been different. Right? In other words, if it wasn't that the Nazis did the most unbelievable damage they could do to the Jewish people between 1933 and 1945. Right? But imagine we were still living with Nazis, right? 70 years later. So the Kalim of the Beis HaMikdash, the vessels of the Holy Temple. So Titus takes them back to Rome. And there was an enormous parade, right, really kind of unparalleled in Roman history. Tremendous parade showing off the booty of the Beis HaMikdash. So Josephus writes that they were able to get these things, tables, bowls, platters, all of solid gold and very massive. Veils, the high priest's vestments, including the precious stones, and many other articles for public worship. Furthermore, the treasurer of the temple by the name of Pinchas, being taken prisoner, disclosed the tunics and the girdles worn by the priests, abundance of purple and scarlet kept for the repairs to the veils of the temple, along with cinnamon and cassia and multitude of other spices, which were burned as incense to God. Many other treasures were delivered up by him. First of all, just a fascinating footnote to all of this. There's a Mishnah in Shkalim that lists out for us the names of the functionaries in the Beis HaMikdash. There's a whole debate among the Mefarshim. Were these the names of the last people to occupy the office? Were these the names, like kind of unofficial titles that were given to the people who occupy them? If you look at the Mishnah there in Shkalim, it tells us the name of the person who was in charge of the clothes of the Kohanim. Name was Pinchas al-Malbush. So this is Pinchas al-Malbush, right, is forced by the Romans to show where all of the stuff in the Beis HaMikdash is. And just point out parenthetically, Josephus mentions here, he says the abundance of purple and scarlet kept for necessary repairs. Again, we talked about the water at the very beginning this morning. Just to imagine, when we talk about the Beis HaMikdash, we think, there's a menorah, there's a mizbeach, right? There's a shulchan, right? But to think about the amount of other things, right? The Mishnah says there were 93 kelim that were used as part of the daily service. 93 different kinds of instruments that they needed to put into work. To think, that the tremendous, the treasures of Polystrap, right, that were needed to keep this thing up and moving, right? Everybody knows, right, that when you build a shul, right, it's not just a question. This is not an appeal, but it's true. In other words, it's not just when you put stuff into the shul, you have to pay for the maintenance also. Right? If you don't maintain it, right, it falls apart. So you're talking about a tremendous amount of treasure taken to Rome from the Beis HaMikdash. So they built in a tremendous amount of Orwell before 1984. Vespasian decided to construct a monument after the war called the Temple of Peace. The Temple of Peace in Rome. In the Temple of Peace, he brought, made this like a museum, right? A museum of things that he had looted. Here too, he laid up the vessels of gold for the temple of the Jews, on which he prided himself. But their law and the purple hangings of the sanctuary he ordered to be deposited and kept in the palace. So he splits up the kelim. He's got half the kelim, right, on display in the Temple of Peace Museum. And in the palace of the Emperor of Rome itself, he takes the parochas and he takes the Sefer Torah from the Beis HaMikdash. They now live in the palace of the Roman Empire. So it's interesting, we have a number of sources in Chazal, right, that tell us that people went to go see them. Right? So I'll give you an example. There's a Tosefta that says, Rabbi Elazar Yossi says, I went to Rome. Right? Rome had a Jewish community, and it was a place that people used to go for shtadlonos. Right? There was no, today you go to Washington for APACs. If you had to intervene with the government, then right, you would go to Rome. So while he's in Rome, they take him to see the treasures of the Beis HaMikdash. And he sees the parochas, and he says that you can see still drops of blood on the parochas. Dried blood, what's the blood from? This is the blood that Kohen Gadol used to, before, as part of the Avodah Yom Kippur, would take the blood of the sacrifices. He would sprinkle them. He would sprinkle them l'fnai v'l'fnim. He would do it both inside the Kodesh HaKadoshim, and then he would do it outside of the parochas also. So I'm trying to imagine, and we have people who testified that they saw the menorah, that they saw the tzitz, they saw the crown of the Kohen Gadol, but excuse me. So what do you think it's like? For somebody 100 years after the destruction of the Mikdash, to walk into a museum, where the docent is telling you, right, this is what was used for the ancient rituals of the Jews before their temple was destroyed and they left, international significance. Right? What does it mean to sit there, right, and to look at the curtain of the Kodesh HaKadoshim and think this is the closest I'm ever going to get to Yom Kippur? So I don't know. I don't really know what the answer is to that question. I've wondered, there's something a little bit funny about the way that we go to the Kotel today. You go to the Kotel, it's really beautiful. The bar mitzvahs there on Mondays and Thursdays, and everybody's happy, and they're throwing candy. You're looking at the sign of the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash, right? I don't know, is that really a place that we're having a party? It's like, God willing, we'll get there. God willing, the day will come and we'll get there. But the question of these physical remains and what they represent, I think is a significant thing to think about as well. We'll go to the Kinos, Al Churban Beis HaMikdash. The next Kina, Mi'ite Rosh Hashanah, is about what are really the foundational events for Ashkenazi Jewry, the events of the First Crusade in 1096. So in 1096, when, really in 1095, Pope Urban II declared a holy war to liberate the city of Jerusalem, to restore it to Christian rule from the Muslims. That in the gathering of the armies to go to the Middle East, the details of this are somewhat complicated, particularly in some of the following armies of various kinds of thugs of different sort. The notion became, well, why, if we're going to destroy the infidel in the Holy Land, why don't we destroy the infidel down the block first? So during the summer of 1096, some of the earliest communities of Ashkenazi Jewry, the communities of Speyer, Magenza, and Vermeiza, Speyer, Worms, and Mainz, were butchered by the armies of the Crusades. Now it's interesting, Ashkenazi Jewry starts from a very, very small place. There was a genetic study that was done that suggests that most Ashkenazim are descended from, I think, 30 or 40 people. There's a very small base that Ashkenazi Jewry started from. These were not huge cities. They're very significant in terms of their impact, their significance to the Ashkenazi Jewish community. Right? These are the places, for instance, when Rashi, who lived in France, was a young man, wanted to come and receive the Masorah of German Jewry, right? It was the Beis Medrash and Worms that he sought out. Right? These were the places that were looked to by Ashkenazim as foundation. So in the Kina, it tells us about when these things happen. They happen over the period of Susa Omer, which is parenthetically why what was once the most widespread custom of mourning during Sfira among Ashkenazim was from Rosh Chodesh Iyar until Shavuos, because that was the time that these events took place. Okay, so in 5 paragraphs down, Uvemar yigoni v'atzapi yilel achbira. In my bitterness, I will compose a kina. Kilos hakodesh harigosam hayom bizarre, for the holy communities as we remember them being killed. Kehal vermaiza. Right, the community of Worms, which is a wonderful Bechuna, Bechura, and a special, unique community, Ga'ine Eretz, these were people who were giants, geniuses. Ta'amayim, Kitshu Shem HaMyuchad B'Mar. Twice, there were 2 rounds that hit Worms. Once, Be'eser M'shloshim B'chodesh Ziv, once on the 23rd day of the month of Iyar. And once, b'chodesh hashlishi b'kriyas halel l'shor. And once, at the beginning of the 3rd month, as they were saying Hallel. So this takes place, in other words, the massacre of Worms Jewry takes place on Rosh Chodesh Sivan. Rosh Chodesh Sivan. So I want to read you a fascinating shayla. Rav, the shayla is as follows. In Rosh Chodesh Sivan, the Jews of Worms used to fast. The minhag in Worms was the Jews would fast on Rosh Chodesh Sivan because of the events that we just read here in the Kina. They declared this as a fast day. So there's only one problem. You know what's the problem? They're not allowed to fast on Rosh Chodesh. So what do? So listen to this. They would fast a half a day, and then they would daven mincha early, right after midday, And then they would break their fasts, right? So they not fast on Rosh Chodesh. Now, we have, again, just to wrap your head around what we're talking about here, the Rokeach, who lived maybe 100 years after these events, the Rokeach writes that what they would do, you have to hear this, Nagu l'kros b'shacharis b'Rosh Chodesh. So in the morning, they would lay in Rosh Chodesh laning, u'le'erev vayechal v'dirsh. Right? They would read, like a real finance, they would read Vayechal, they would read the Haftarah of Dirshu, what we're going to say this afternoon. That was the minhag in the city of Worms on Rosh Chodesh. Now, comes along one year, and Rosh Chodesh is on Friday. Rosh Chodesh is on Friday. So the way that they, again, in a regular year, they would fast, have a mincha, break their fast. But the question is, how do you do this on Friday? So here's what they used to do. And again, we're not here to judge, we're here to listen. Rosh Chodesh Sivan be'erev Shabbos, when Rosh Chodesh Sivan was on Friday, Nagu l'spala mincha u'mariv miyad achar shah gimel michov daled shows achar chatzos. So what they would do, again, I remember I learned this tshuva from my teacher, Rabbi J.J. Schachter, who is just starting. If you think Kinos is long here, his Kinos ends at 5-something today. So when you're done here, if you want more Kinos, whatever he says, I'm sure is better than what I have to say. But so what would they do? 3 o'clock in the afternoon, they would daven mincha, and then they would make Shabbos. Right? So you thought you had early Shabbos before. They used to make early Shabbos at 3 in the afternoon, so that because they needed to break their fast to eat. Once they were doing it, they just made early Shabbos. So there's a new Rav in Worms, the Shvus Yaakov. The Shvus Yaakov comes to town. I guess the Gabbai tells him, I'm going over the schedule for this week. Yeah, Mincha and Kabbalah Shabbos is at 3. And he looks at 3 o'clock. He says, you can't actually make Shabbos then. And he said, yes, but we always make Shabbos then. So he looks into the whole question, and he finds out that this is, the minhag has been, the Rabbanim have complained about this, right? And the people do it anyways. That's the minhag in Worms. Now, here's the kicker of this. You know what year this tshuva was written? So again, the First Crusade, the events that started the fast, they were 1096. This tshuva was written in 1716, right? Half a millennium later, right? The Jews of Worms have so imprinted on their consciousness that Rosh Chodesh Sivan is a day of disaster for them, right? That they're still fasting, right? And it's a minhag of this town. Nowhere else in the world does this. And it's interesting, it was remarkable that this was the case, right? And it's quoted. The Beis Yosef says that this is the minhag. And the Magen Avraham, they don't talk about this weird Friday thing, right? But there's the idea that this was a fast day that was meaningful to the Jews of Worms. The idea that the day is never going to be the same, it was very powerful. So I want to make a very, very tentative suggestion. And the suggestion is that part of the reason why this survived is that when something happens connected to something on the calendar, right, it has a totally different kind of impact. Right? It meant that it's not just that this happened on a day. It meant that every year when you come to Rosh Chodesh Sivan, right, that together with saying Halal and saying Musaf, right, and getting the cheese to make the cheesecake, right, whatever you're doing that time of year, imprinted, indelible on that time of year is that this is a time of disaster, right? It's a time of sadness, right? And certainly for the immediate generation, the idea that it left its mark, I think is something which is very, very true. And it is a testament to the power of Masorah in this community that this was communicated over 5 centuries to a degree that it evolved in a way that perhaps is halachically questionable, right? But it was still so powerfully meaningful for the people who lived there. It's interesting, The war in Hungary was different. The war in every country was different. The war in Hungary was different because effectively all of the deportations in Hungary took place mostly between Pesach and Shavuos. And it was basically an annihilation of huge communities over the period of a few weeks. And there are a number of significance to this, but I've heard that because of that, within families of Hungarian survivors, that very often there are, a Pesach, a Shavuos, has a totally different feel to it because of those memories that are connected to it. And they tell me one of the shuls in Cleveland is the Green Road Synagogue in Cleveland. Right? Its other name, which doesn't get used as much, is the Marmor Rusher Center. Right? It was built by Jews from Marmor Russia. So the rabbi there told me that it's pretty much coming. But there is a day in Iyar, right, which is the day that everybody from those towns who founded the shul, with their relatives, were sent to Auschwitz. And that day was for them, it was like a regular day during the week. Something like hundreds of people would show up to shul for that one day to say Kaddish. Right? That was their private day. So I was thinking about this in processing the terrorist attack that happened in Chalamish and Nefeit Suf last week, 10 days ago. I was thinking about it because it happened on Shabbos. I was thinking about it because it happened during a Shalom Zachar. So I want to read, first to make it a little bit more real, I want to read you something that was posted online by a woman who lives there, American woman, named Batsheva Davis Adami. Friday night, my in-laws were with us and a Hebrew University abroad student and her friend from America. Gilad came home from shul as her husband, all excited because the soldiers who were on duty in our yeshuv accepted his invitation to come and eat Shabbos dinner with us. He rushes in and says, "Shev, there are 4 chayalim here. Is it okay if they eat with us?" Of course, the answer is yes. We've been wanting to have the soldiers for a long time. They came with all their guns, their equipment, their smiles, and their gratitude. We sang Shalom Aleichem, not knowing that the angels of peace won't be visiting this Shabbat, rather the devil will be. We sat down, ate, drank, sang, ate dessert, started singing some more. In the middle of our song, the commander's military phone was alerted and ringing. He answered before we knew it. All the soldiers jumped up, grabbed their guns, and bolted out the door. This wasn't how we envisioned the too abrupt end to our beautiful Shabbat meal. They were trying to say thank you while they were running out, but this commander kept yelling, "Yalla, karamashu, karamashu." Something happened, something happened. So I thought something was going on right outside the yeshuv. Maybe the all too standard Molotov cocktail throwing or something. I just want to pause for a second just to think about that phrase, the all too standard Molotov cocktail throwing. Within about 10 minutes, the yeshuv's warning siren started going off. That meant we all had to be inside our homes on complete lockdown. The 2 girls staying in my house are not observant, and they went to their room to check their phones. I went in to check on them. They didn't want to tell me what they saw. After a minute, they told me 3 people were critically injured inside our yeshuv by a terrorist who infiltrated it and barged into someone's Shabbos dinner and started stabbing with his knife. 2 are already dead, completely slaughtered. The fear was paralyzing. The worry, the anger, the fear was all growing, getting too big. I was exploding inside. Our phones kept going off, telling us to stay inside, lock everything, and stay there. The ages Yossi and Tova Solomon lived 3 doors away from us. They had a new grandson born a few days earlier. The family decided to come to the grandparents to celebrate and have a Shalom Zachar on Friday night at 10 p.m. The new baby and the parents stayed in the hospital for Shabbos, celebrating from afar. But in the house, it was Yossi and Tova, the residents, their daughter Chaya, their son Elad with his wife and 5 children. At 9:50 p.m., a Palestinian animal terrorist barged in the door, knife in hand. The slaughter began. and wouldn't have ended had the neighbors not heard all the screaming. My close friend's parents live across the path and heard the screams. Her father ran over to check and saw from outside there was a terrorist violently murdering their beloved friends and neighbors. Her brother was home for Shabbat. He ran to his gun, ran across the pathway, stood outside the window of the house, and took one shot and brought the terrorists down. He then started searching around the rest of the house to make sure there weren't any terrorists, while his mother called for help, and security started arriving and attempted to save who could be saved. Yossi, Elad, and Chaya had no chance. They were slaughtered. There's no other word to use. They started working on Tova. Tova is no longer in critical condition, fighting for her life. But her dear, amazing, happy, incredible, sweet, sweet husband Yossi is no longer. And her two precious children are no longer. This is not a reality that can be digested or understood or accepted. I camped out in our living room. Obviously, no sleep was going to happen, and my kids are on the second floor. If anyone is breaking in, they're not getting to my kids. So we slept at the entrance to the house. Gilad and I stayed in the living room until messages came in the nighttime search was over, maybe 3 or 4 a.m. But they said searching will be happening until Minyan starts at 8:30 a.m. So until 8:15 a.m., no one is allowed to leave their homes or unlock their doors. This is supposed to be a beautiful Shabbos. It was the most horrific Shabbos. As we ate lunch, there's a knock on our door with more soldiers. My throat went dry and my heart dropped into my knees until I saw their faces. The same soldiers came back from Shabbos dinner the night before. They wanted to come properly and say thank you. No, thank you. We sat with them in our yard, with our children and guests, and they started rehashing details from the night before. We listened, we needed to for them. We listened and spoke and ate and drank, so surreal, so calm, but no peace at all, just broken, the heart, the mind, the soul, the breath, broken. At Shabbos lunch, Lavi, my almost 4-year-old, wanted to sing a song. He opened the bencher and pointed to some words. Yes, the bencher was upside down. And said, Ima, sing this one, pointing randomly at some words. I said, okay, not knowing what I'd start singing. And what came out of my mouth was Kol Ha'olam Kulo, Gesher Tsar Ma'or. Lavi knows it, and he was excited and started singing along with me more loudly when we got to the second part of the song. V'ha'ikar lo lefachet klal. The fear is so strong, it's awful, it can paralyze. But we can't be afraid. Then we can't move. So at the risk of maybe being voyeuristic, how could these people and other people in Sishuv sit down to sing Shalom Aleichem the next week? What's going to happen next time somebody sings Kol Ha'olam Kulo for this woman, what associations she has with it? What's the next Shalom Zachar in this community or for this family going to feel like? So, on some level, it's going to be gvura. It's going to be absolute heroism. Right? And they're going to go and they're not going to stop us. And Klal Yisrael is still here. And there's going to be another Shabbos, another Shalom Zachar, another Rosh Chodesh Sivan. And we're not going to allow it to stop. But on the other hand, how can it not leave some kind of a mark? I saw, and I'm probably going to share this again in the future, I saw the printed invitation to the bris of the baby whose Shalom Zachar was supposed to be celebrated that night. The invitation had a pasuk from Yecheskel. It's a pasuk that we say at a bris, and it's a pasuk that we say, many people say as part of the Haggadah as well. So the Navi Cheskel gives a parable of God saving the Jewish people from Egypt. And it says, that God finds a child lying in a field abandoned, dripping in blood. And I say to you that you will live, the shot way to read it, you'll live in spite of the blood. In other words, in spite of the situation that you find yourself in, you will continue to live. So the Medrash says it's not in spite, it's because. That the reference is the blood of Bris Milah, and the second blood is the blood of the Korban Pesach, the two symbols of the covenant with God. And God says, you'll live because you have these two mitzvos to connect yourselves to me with. And that's why we say it in a bris, and that's why we say it in the Seder. And that's what was printed on the invitation to this bris. It had the pasuk, and then in big letters, you will live in your blood. So we've been living in blood for a very long time. And as we say this Kino, we try to put ourselves back in that mode of terror, right? That what Batsheva described in her social media posting, I think is something that the Jews of Worms would have understood. And as we say this Kino, to try to imagine the experiences of all those Jews on that terrible Rosh Chodesh 1,000 years ago, but also to try to think about all the Jews afterwards who relived and remembered and mourned those events on every Rosh Chodesh that followed. Hamite Rosh Hashanah. Eso Rav Salmavel. Shani Vishoina Brove Yomargo. Ayicha Cheva Yucha. You're a Chawaf, I'll say it forever. A Chawaf. This is why. Shlishi, Napach liyodin v'tzara, b'yomatanda, sibartilish tashra, nisashra, yonasinos, kemochein osvazra, also lemaro lemakom v'tzara, take another take by other shalach, Kisrefas Beisal of Hainu, Holam, Happy Rob, Achas Kena Yomizan, Face Israel Amadonai, Kinaf Luvafor, Valelani Bofiva, Lily Bean, Abesis Yalam Adonai Kinaf Luvafor. Beis Yisrael Amadana Kinos. Okay. The next kina is based on a fascinating and somewhat perplexing medrash. The kina Az Bahaloch Yirmiyahu. So the medrash says, the thrust of the medrash is that Yirmiyahu went to somehow try to connect to the patriarchs, the matriarchs, the great figures in the history of the Jewish people, to tell them that Klal Yisrael is in trouble, that the Klal Yisrael is in existential danger, and that their role as parents has not ended, that they need to come and advocate for their children. And eventually, the very end of it, the end of the Kina, says that it is the imahos, it is the mothers of Klal Yisrael who in the end turn the tables of hope for the Jewish people. And this, of course, is rooted in the Nevuah of Yirmiyahu, of Kol V'Rama Nishma Rachel Mevakel V'neha. The Yirmiyahu talked about hearing Rachel crying for her children. So if Rachel is crying for her children, right, the Paita now tells us it's not just Rachel, it's also Leah and Bilhah and Zilpah. It's all of the imahos. Some of you at Pesach, we spent a little bit of time talking about Bilhah and Zilpah, who are often forgotten as part of our past of Klal Yisrael, but they're here in the Kina pulling for the Jewish people. So what's interesting is that this medrash certainly has a very kind of mystical, visionary kind of character to it. In other words, what does it mean that Yirmiyahu is talking to all of the Avos, right? Especially given the fact that they're not even buried in the same places, right? You have the Avos and Maras Machpelah. Moshe Rabbeinu makes an appeal here as well. So it's not 100% clear whether this medrash is intended to be taken literally or not. However, the way that it sets itself up at the outset here, right, where it says, B'haloch Yirmiyahu el kivrei avos, when Yirmiyahu went to the graves of the ancestors, again, this is rooted in our Midrashic tradition, it is intriguing to consider the possibility that this is some kind of a prophecy that happened, or a vision that happened somehow tied in to an actual physical visit of Yirmiyahu Hanavi to the Ma'aras HaMachpelah, to the grave of the patriarchs and matriarchs. So I'd like to take a moment to consider the implications of that trip. In other words, if it really was true that in the last days before the destruction of Yerushalayim, that Yirmiyahu made his way to Hebron. Now, the reality is, as far as we can tell, Yerushalayim was really the last Jewish significant city to fall. Right? Remember, we don't, again, when it comes to the second Beis HaMikdash, we have Josephus, so we have more information about how the war was prosecuted in detail. But as far as we know, and again, we have some archaeological records to confirm this, right? Yerushalayim was the final shoe to drop in the complete destruction of what was left of Malchus Yehuda. So even though Hebron, which is a very, very ancient city, the Chumash talks about how old Hebron really is. I was in Hebron a couple of years ago, and my brother-in-law, who was a tour guide, took me to steps by an ancient wall of Hebron they've excavated. And, we're standing on these steps, and I realized, this is the wall of Avram's Hebron. I'm standing on the stairs, it could be, where Avram was negotiating to buy this place in the first place. It's an amazing thing. So in all probability, by the time of Yirmiyahu Hanavi, Hebron was Yudim, right? No more Jews in Hebron. So what happens to Hebron? So to answer that question, I have to explain a difficult issue that we find in the text that we have in Tanakh connected to the Churban. So everybody knows the first Beis HaMikdash was destroyed by Babylonians. And yet, in a number of different places, we have it in Eicha, we have it in the Psalm Al Naris Bavel, we have these references to Edom. The question is, what's Edom doing? Right? Why are we talking about Edom here suddenly? So Rashi, quoting some Midrashim, says that this is a prophetic reference to the second Beis HaMikdash. In later rabbinic tradition, Rome is referred to as Edom for complicated reasons, and that this is a prophecy of what's going to happen. In other words, when the Eicha, when the Kapitel Tehillim talks about what's going to be with the first Beis HaMikdash, it also engages the second Beis HaMikdash as well. The Ibn Ezra says this is not possible. Right? It doesn't seem like this makes sense. And again, I think that on a pshat level, he's correct. While there may be an embedded secondary nevuah level to these texts, the idea that, at the time of the destruction of the first Beis HaMikdash, right, that Yirmiyahu is saying, Sisi v'simchi bas Edom, gam alayich tavor kos, be happy for now, daughter of Edom, but your turn is coming, and you'll also be punished. In other words, that he's talking about a Rome that his audience would have no idea even existed in the world. It's hard to understand that could be the primary meaning of the text. So the Ibn Ezra posits that, and again, this is perhaps a shot to them, right, that the Edomim who lived historically, right, in southern Jordan, right, the descendants of Esav, were in the process, they were aiders and abettors to the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash. Right? That they came in to loot in the ruins, and that they egged on the Bavlim, Oru Hadi Yisod. They weren't really part of this struggle between the Babylonians and the Jews, but they were opportunistic. They came in, and again there was, in many ways, a very difficult history between the Jews and Edom, the descendants of Esav. And what we know is that in the ensuing time after the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash, that there was a migration of Edom, right, in through the Negev up all the way to Hebron. And we know centuries later, by the time of Chanukah, in the book of Maccabees, when it talks about how the Jews started reconquering Eretz Yisrael, one of the things that it talks about is that it took Hebron back from the Edomim. So I would say two things are for sure, and then we can speculate together. For sure is that Hebron became a city of Edom, slightly later in Jewish history. Number two, I think we can say with surety that at the time of the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash, Hebron was empty of Jews. So we don't know exactly when the transition came. We don't know, are there already at that point, right, were there either pockets or squatters. Were they starting to squat? And I would add the following possibility, that one would imagine that the people of Edom may have had their own narrative about Maras HaMachpelah. Right? Remember, Maras HaMachpelah is where Avram, Yitzchak, Sarah, and Rivka, all of their ancestors are buried. And it's fascinating to note that the Midrashim talk about the idea, right, that Esav powerfully wanted to be buried in Maras HaMachpelah. There are any number of Midrashim that talk about a struggle. There are two versions of the Medrash, one that says that it happened when Yitzchak died, and one that says that it happened when Yaakov died. But in both versions of the Medrash, that Esav is killed, and his head is buried in Maras HaMachpelah. So you wonder, and I stress the wonder, that for the Edomim, did they have their own connection to Maras HaMachpelah? Did they see this as their place, that they're the real descendants of Avram and Yitzchak? And if they did, is it possible, and I only say possible, that Maras HaMachpelah was, as it were, a magnet that drew the Edomic occupation of Hebron around it? So it's interesting. One of the things we know about the Navi Yirmiyahu is that even though he was a Navi of destruction, As we mentioned before, he had this hope. God told him he was also going to be a Navi of building. There's a famous nevuah that during the siege of Yerushalayim, his cousin Hanamel comes to him and says there's a field, he has a whole thing with his cousin Hanamel, there's a field that belongs to the family that he wants to redeem it and buy it back into the family. The only problem is the field has new occupiers. There's a Babylonian army camped on your field. Right? So God tells him to do it anyways, that this is a sign of hope in our connection to Eretz Yisrael. Right? That even though it's now occupied by foreigners, that we believe we're going to go back. That's the story of the field of Canaan. So I wonder if that's part of the trip to Mars Machpelah also. Right? If Jews are not going to be in Mars Machpelah for a very long time, and maybe if other people are moving into the area who are going to say, no, this is our past and our history. Yirmiyahu, when he's going to David for the merit of the fathers and the mothers to be with us, maybe he's also going to reassert for the last time, for hundreds of years maybe, the Jewish claim to Mars Machpelah. So I think what's striking is that, ironically enough, the Jewish claim on Chevron and Mars Machpelah has been under question for thousands of years. So I'm sure people are familiar that the great ethical and moral geniuses of UNESCO recently declared the Mars Machpelah and Hebron to be an Islamic holy site in danger. Historical Islamic holy site in danger. So this is an old business with the UN, the business of Hebron. There's an amazing story. In 1976, the ambassador to the UN for Israel was a man by the name of Chaim Herzog. Some of you might remember Chaim Herzog. He gave a very famous speech at the UN when the UN voted for the infamous Zionism as racism. So Chaim Herzog gave a famous speech where he ripped up the resolution. So Chaim Herzog is Banam Shel Kedoshim. He's the son of one of the Gedolim in the 20th century. He begins with Isaac Halevi Herzog. And the story is that when he was ambassador to the UN, Simchas Torah night, he went to 770 for Hakafos. So, before the Hakafa, the Lavater Rebbe calls him over. He says to him, you need to go to the UN and tell them the Hebron belongs to the Jewish people. It belongs to you. It belongs to you because you're a Levi. And Hebron is one of the Ari Halavim. And he said, I don't know if they're going to listen. If you want, tell them in Hebrew, not in English. So the Lavater Rebbe says to him, that if they want to give you back the 400 shekel that Avram paid for Mars Machpelah, make sure that they know that there's 4,000 years interest on it. Fine. That was Simchas Torah. November 3rd, 1976, on the stationery of the United Nations General Assembly. I would like to draw attention to the fact that the plot of land containing the two of the patriarchs and held holy by Jews throughout the ages as the cave of Machpelah was purchased by the Hebrew patriarch Abraham almost 4,000 years ago. The details of this purchase are recorded in the Bible, which the Jewish people enunciate the principles of human brotherhood, which inspired the creation of this organization. The relevant passage appears in the book of Genesis, and he proceeds to quote verbatim the first two aliyahs of Parshas Kaisar. Although of great historical moment and certainly of pertinence to the present day, this transaction was not, of course, registered with the Secretariat in accordance with Article 102, Paragraph 1, since it was not in the nature of an international agreement. And in addition, it was concluded somewhat prior to the coming into force of the charter. I have the honor, therefore, to request that this letter be now circulated as an official document of the General Assembly. Signed, Chaim Herzog, Permanent Representative of Israel to the United Nations. There was, a couple of years ago, the UNESCO's World Heritage Site monitoring called attention to a Palestinian village called Batir. So Batir has very ancient terrorist vineyards. And there was some concern that Israel was going to develop stuff near there and destroy this ancient site. Right? So the UN said Batir is a site of historical significance, and that we want it to be a protected historical area. So it's an interesting thing about Batir. It's a fascinating thing. Arab villages preserve historical information in their names, sometimes for thousands of years. So Batir used to be a Jewish city. It was a city called Beitar. Right? Beitar was a city that we mourn its destruction today as part of Tisha B'Av. The Mishnah says one of the things that happened on Tisha B'Av is that Beitar was destroyed. Right? And Batir may have significance for Palestinian history, such as it is, right? But the idea that you are talking about historical significance and ignore the fact that hundreds of thousands of Jews were killed in the last stand of Jewish sovereignty until the 20th century, right, perhaps is something that is part of its historical record. And a friend of mine, an old chavrus of mine, wrote about this, wrote an article about this time and a half and pointed out that the Gemara tells us about those terraced vineyards outside of Beitar, that they didn't need to fertilize them for 7 years because of the Jewish blood that was soaked into them beforehand. So the question of what is our heritage, right? And again, certainly what's been going on the last few weeks with the Har Bayis, right? And I'm not interested in getting into the politics of it. At the moment, I think that there are a number of legitimate positions, perhaps, to take on such an issue. But the idea that when it comes to these places, when it comes to a Beitar, when it comes to Hebron, when it comes to Yerushalayim, that part of our identity is affirming our connection to these places. And even whether it be the Palestinians, whether it be the Edomim, whoever it is, who have their own stories to tell about them, we need to be convinced of our own stories, right? That we need to be convinced of the magnitude of what we did. So we'll say that Az Baloch Yirmiyahu, we'll go with the Navi Yirmiyahu back to Hebron, back to the Avos, the Imos. Remember that we have people pulling for us in Hebron. Az Baloch Yirmiyahu. I have tachas bris brisi akim es yitzchok ma'aselef lachem bonai g'zeirahim elefonai morvi yirmiyo v'timar miriyo. Lachem bonai g'zeirahim elefonai Patzra dem Son Asher b'cheikiya Hadam v'riz hayis keep sefer riz Kol b'chilei amusofef esal v'veho Rachel achosam v'akval b'neho Zilpa maka paneho v'ilkonenes m'shtei yodeho Shusmi v'muchaschem l'yam alei Kol mishalos lecha Shulachti b'velo manchem Hinei mishovei polus mechem. The next Kina Eish Tukad B'Kirbi is the Kina, probably one of the most accessible Kinos. The contrasts for us the high point and low points of Jewish history. The idea of the glory of leaving Mitzrayim and the pain of leaving Yerushalayim. So I just want to share just a brief thought. It's a thought I found from Shmuel Menachem Sirloy, who is a Dutch survivor of the Holocaust. So there's a famous medrash, Pirkei Rebbe Lazar, that talks about the fact that Kriyas Yamsuf was not just one miracle. One of the many miracles of Kriyas Yamsuf was that the medrash says that it wasn't just one path, right? But the Yamsuf was split into 12 paths, and that each Shevet had their own path. So this is an image we've spoken about in various other instances in the past, the significance of what that means. But the Medrash says that you could see through the walls, right? That however the water froze itself, you could see if I'm in this side of it, that it was as if there were windows that Vayroin Elu as Elu, so they could see each other. So he says, what's the significance of this maze? So he said, when I was liberated at the end of the war, you'd think this should be the time of the greatest simcha, right? It's like, it's over, right? This is all over. The Nazis have been decisively defeated, right? And now we can go back to life. He said, you know why it wasn't? It wasn't because we had no idea what happened to our loved ones, right? In other words, we may be liberated, but we have no idea where anyone else was, right? And until we could figure that out, right? That sense of separation, of alienation, of not knowing where they are, that killed the whole thing. Right? It was so painful because we were all alone. So you can imagine how scared the Jews were going into the Yam Suf, right? As you see the Egyptians coming from behind you, they were terrified. Better to die here until finally the Yam Suf opens up. So Shmuel Menachem Sirloy says, you know what happened? God made windows because he was concerned for the Jews that they should know where their relatives are. I know that I'm okay. I know that my Shevet, maybe I'm here, maybe I got my wife, my kids, but what about my cousin? What about my neighbor? The miracle of Kriyas Yamsuf is that you knew where everybody was the whole time. You didn't have to worry. And we weren't given it. Eish Tukad B'Kirbi. Eish Tukad B'Kirbi, Alosi Alibi, B'Tzeisi Mitzrayim, Negenim Nemanaski, Tzeisi Yerushalayim, Az Yashir Moshe, Shir Lo Yinashe, B'Tzeisi Mitzrayim, Kanein Yirmiyah, Nanein Yah, Tzeisi Yerushalayim, Beisis Kanein, Shachan Hanan, B'Tzeisi the God Shamayim, Ubitzvanayim, Tzeisi Mitzrayim, Tzeisi Yerushalayim, Ashkein v'Arev, Tzivas HaCharev, Tzeisi Mitzrayim, Adnaras Bavel, Tzeisi Yerushalayim, U'marechor Adonai, Elochel es lefonai, Tzeisi Mitzrayim, Erev l'Tush, Tevach l'Tush, Tzeisi Yerushalayim, Zevach u'mincha v'shemen ha'mishcha v'tzeisim v'mitzrayim Hagim v'shabbasos v'mafisim v'osos v'tzeisim v'mitzrayim Tavu ha'olim le'arba'ati golim v'tzeisim v'mitzrayim Yovel u'shmita v'eretz shokita v'tzeisim v'mitzrayim Speaks the fires the prince Tzeisim Yerushalayim Kaparos Varam Avnei Zikaron V'tzeisim Mitzrayim Avnei Yakel V'zlei Abel V'tzeisim V'im Aronim V'shivim Zikeinim V'tzeisim Mitzrayim Tzeisim Modim L'chrim L'gam Tzeisim Yerushalayim Moshe Yirenu V'Aaron Echinu V'tzeisim Mitzrayim V'nimul Chadetz Aradinus Keis V'tzeisim Yerushalayim Naroch Milchama V'Adonai Shama V'tzeisim Mitzrayim Amen Amen Tzeisim Yerushalayim Tzeitzrei Baruchas V'Sidrei Ma'arachas Tzeisim Mitzrayim Olos U'Zlachim Yishai Nichachim V'Tzeisim Mitzrayim I call it Tzeisim Loyim Barei Mikvos L'Chavod Nikvos V'Tzeisim Mitzrayim V'Tzeisim Yerushalayim Tzitza Zahav Am Shel V'Raham Tzeisim Mitzrayim Chanezer Lafos Oezer V'Tzeisim Yerushalayim K'dusham Nevot Nivrach L'Adonai Nira V'Tzeisim Mitzrayim Yivam V'Tzeisim Rina Yeshua Chatzot Rosat Teruah V'Tzeisim Mitzrayim Yerushalayim Shulchanim Menorah Chalil Ketorah V'Tzeisim Mitzrayim Soreha Chesem Hatzeh V'Tzeisim Yerushalayim Torah Seudah V'Yachada V'Tzeisim Mitzrayim Zazayin V'Simcha V'Nasya Yavana V'Shoy Yerushalayim Okay, the next kina, Evel HaRer, is another one of the kinos that were written in the aftermath of the First Crusade. And among the things that it talks about, one of those difficult things that this kina talks about is the question of the killing of children. That we know, we'll start with what we know for a fact, that during the time of the Crusades, particularly the First Crusade, we have stories of parents who killed their own children rather than let them fall into the hands of the Crusaders and being raised as Christians. So I remember once hearing my teacher, Dr. Chaim Soloveitchik, once speaking about this, to try to understand the mindset. And he said that imagine that you knew that you were going to die, but not only are you going to die, but that your children are going to be raised by the murderers who killed you, the people who were terrible, evil people, and that in your death, right, that they are going to survive in the most awful kind of way. Right? That's a terrible dilemma to be in. So this is a tremendous sugya in halakha. And in fact, there is and it's not at all simple. There's Dazikena Mibali Atosfos in Parshas Noah that comes out very strongly against this whole business. It tells a whole story about somebody who asked the Shiloh and was told, don't do this, and killed their children anyways, and something happened, the cavalry came in, right, and they were saved, right, their children wouldn't have even, been taken from them. So it's halakhically very complex. At the same time, Dr. Soloveitchik has pointed out that the case against them was not really made in poskim because there was a sense that Ashkenazi Jews saw themselves as Zerah Shakdosha, that they were the children of martyrs, and it wasn't for them to judge what they did. I think that people who were moved that this was the kindest thing that they could do for their children, it was something that was not for us to sit and judge. So again, whether they were correct or not, the sense of suffering, right, that these people were living through, I think is something which comes out reading the words of the Kinos. So let's take a look at the Kinos of Evel A'orer. Evel A'orer. Okay, we're going to skip a little bit ahead of the list due to time. To number 40 on the list, Sion Halil Sishali, which is the famous Kina of Rabbi Yehuda Levi. So Rabbi Yehuda Levi was a Jew who lived in one of those rare, relatively successful, comfortable, wealthy, and happy times. The Jews of Muslim Spain in his time were educated, wealthy, and powerful. And even so, Rabbi Yehuda Levi felt the need, lived with a burning love for Eretz Yisrael, with dreams of living in Eretz Yisrael. If you read his work of philosophy, the Kuzari, right, you'll see the central place that Eretz Yisrael has in it, as well as he writes there in the Kuzari pretty strong words about we'll call it the cognitive dissonance between the fact that we daven a liturgy which is drenched in yearning for Yerushalayim and for Eretz Yisrael, and yet here we are. And Yehuda Levi essentially accuses himself of hypocrisy. He says that this is a very strong attack on the Jewish people. Yaakov Emden wrote in his Siddur very strong words about the idea that we build beautiful homes in Chutz La'aretz and don't think about Eretz Yisrael the same way. So Yehuda Levi put his money where his mouth was and took off for Eretz Yisrael. And nobody knows if he made it. There's actually, those of you who are interested in pursuing this further, there's a fascinating article online, I can give the link to whoever's interested, by Eliezer Brodt, who's one of the great historical researchers of our time, about this question about does Rabbi Yehuda Levi make it to Eretz Yisrael or not? Does he ever get there? I'll tell you, if you go to the steps that go down to the Kotel from the Jewish quarter, there's a sign there that says Ma'alot Rabbi Yehuda Levi. These are Rabbi Yehuda Levi's steps. They say that Rabbi Yehuda Levi came there looking over the Arabayas at that spot, and he dropped to his knees and he's saying, Tzion Halosi Shali. He said the piyut that we're about to say, and then was trampled by an Arab horseman going through the streets. That's the story that they tell. Again, you can look at Eliezer Brodt's work to see, what happened, what didn't happen. The love of Eretz Yisrael is a for sure thing. And so a friend, a recent colleague, Rabbi Tzvi Engel, showed me in the memoirs of Yosef Mendelevich. Yosef Mendelevich was a Jew who lived in Russia, who was filled with love for Eretz Yisrael. He tried actually to hijack a plane to get him to Israel in the 70s and was sent to Siberia. And he writes in his memoirs, he knew very little, that he remembered a little bit of Shemona Esrei. He was already a shtickle bal tshuva when he went into Siberia. So he tried to reconstitute Shemona Esrei for himself. He wrote it out. He remembered Hakel HaGadol HaGibor Vanora, and he tried to add things. And then after that, he added his personal prayer, please take me out of here, take me to Yerushalayim. And that was the Shemona Esrei. So he said that he knew that you're supposed to daven facing Yerushalayim. Right, so that he had no idea how in a cell he's going to do that. So there's a certain window that he would stand facing the window. He said he remembered he read Sefer Daniel. Right, so in Sefer Daniel it says that when Daniel was in exile in Bavel, he had an upper room, and in his upper room he had a window that faced Yerushalayim, and he used to daven there 3 times a day. It's the 6th or 7th parak, I think, of Daniel. So Mendelevich said he remembered learning that. So he would stand by his window in Siberia, hoping somehow that he was facing Yerushalayim, right, when he davened. It is something that you have to think about over Tisha B'Av, that thousands of years of Jews crying over Yerushalayim, right? And then you have a person in the status of Yehuda Levi, right, who was wealthy and was powerful and respected, right, and gives it all up to run off to Yerushalayim. Yosef Mendelevich, who sits in Siberia for 12 years, because he has a dream of Yerushalayim and stands by his window, hoping he's davening towards Yerushalayim. So I wonder if we take our opportunities of Yerushalayim for granted. We had in the shul, we spent a lot of time between Pesach and Shavuos talking about Jewish Yerushalayim. The fact that we now have, it's interesting. It's a debate among the poskim. It's also a debate politically as well. But I saw today that this Tisha B'Av, 1,200 Jews went up to Har Bayis. So again, I'm not at a place where I'm comfortable telling people necessarily if they ask me whether they should go on Har Bayis or not. But there's something about that, the idea of Jews coming back it's hard not to be touched by it. And to ask yourselves the question, if we have opportunities that Yosef Mendelevich and Yudah Levi had, what do we think about whether we are actualizing that connection to Yerushalayim or not? Tzion halo sisholi l'shlom asirayich. Vertzev hanayich mehod v'achonines afarayich avkiva hamdi ali kivrosav osai v'eshtomein b'chevron alim chakvarayich evor b'yarech b'charmelech v'eshtomein v'ahar evor avarayich Says, Omer dror al kasafares, v'nofes tzuv narai. Yen avan avshi alo faron v'yachai, v'alei faros shimamo. V'alei chashen Eich yero v'yachol shesos, v'ezech ezech yizchavach, lo v'mes k'virai. Oh, eich or yomi masoklein I got our fi or vim the grain sharai. Siam klilas yofiava v'chein tikshiri me'os uvach nikshiru nafshos chavero yichem asmeichu l'shavos. Shechayich, vel mi neviayich, vel mi levayayich, vis sharayich. Yivachol Moshe v'Elohayich, v'ashrei enoshim karik yikarei v'yishkan b'chatzerayich. Ashrei mechake v'yagiya v'yamos orech, v'yivachol shcharayich. The rest of us clear Osim Vaseich, Vishveich, Alei Kadmas Nurayi. Okay, we are pretty close to Chatzos. I want to share something with you before we end this morning. We have the practice in the shul that before saying Alit Zion that we say the kina for the Kedoshim of the Holocaust. So the truth is a bunch of these kinos have been written, and depending which edition you have different kinos. So there's Rabbi Rosenfeld, Schwab, the Bav Rebbe, others have all written kinos for the Holocaust. So I want to share something personal with you. And see if you can get some, make sure those go start at the Ezra session. Ask us and bring up to the session. About a year ago, and I think I may have mentioned this, but I didn't show it to you last Tisha B'Av. I found the Kina, which is going to be handed out now. And it is a Kina, it was printed in an article about Kinos on the Holocaust that was published in the Yad Vashem magazine. And it is a kina that was written supposedly on Tisha B'Av in 1943 in Auschwitz. It was written by a Jew by the name of Shimon Kempler, came from the town of Bochnia, and it is about the region of Poland called Galicia. And it's based on the final kina that we'll say afterwards, Elit Zion, and it is about the destruction of Jewish Galicia. That at that point, this, which was a old, significant, important community in Klal Yisrael, and this was his, as it were, home country. So he wrote a kina about Galicia. And about, when trying to talk about destruction, all of the elements of destruction, I want to look at it inside in a moment. This struck a very strong chord with me because I am Galicianer on my mother's side. So this is very much on my mind. We're leaving town for Rosh Hashanah tomorrow morning. We're going, God willing, this Thursday. We're going to celebrate my grandmother's 99th birthday. She would want me to say B'nai Ayin Hara, so I'll say B'nai Ayin Hara. So my grandmother is turning 99, and we'll have the supposed to celebrate with almost all of her descendants, and she has the supposed that all of her descendants are Shomrei Torah mitzvahs. So in 1942, almost a year before this kina was written, 75 years ago, my grandparents got married on Tu B'Av in the Tarnov ghetto. Tarnov was the town they lived in Galicia, not far from where all of this took place. And they're married in some kind of an apartment somewhere in Tarnov by one of the dayanim of the community who was still there. The story was always in the family. They had a proper wedding with chuppah and kedushin in the ghetto. And my grandfather, Zechron Livracha, used to say, I remember him saying this, my memory is, the 10 people were shot in the street the day of the wedding. So my grandfather was one of, we don't really know how many, siblings, 7, 9, 11, we have the names of a bunch of them. He had one sibling who survived, my Uncle Moshe, who I still remember. And Uncle Moshe lost his wife and 3 children in the concentration camp in Plaszow. Some of you might remember, anybody who saw the movie Schindler's List, which is set, part of it, in Plaszow, that Amon Getz, who was the commandant of the camp, had this dog. If you remember, he had this dog that went with him. So the story in the family is that he sicked the dog on one of my mother's first cousins. So my grandparents and my Uncle Moshe survived the war as they were saved by Oscar Schindler, and that's how we're here today. So to me, reading this, right, again, it's interesting, I just put it together this week, that it's not just my grandmother's 99th birthday, but it's also 75th anniversary as well. So on the one hand, Chamisha Asar B'Av, the 15th of Av, is a very pregnant date in Jewish tradition. Right? The 15th of Av represents the day where you pick up and rebuild after disaster. Right? That's the day when the Jews literally got up out of their graves. So for our family, it's a very significant moment. You know, but the kina that he wrote talks about this whole region with a history, with a culture, with Jews, families, men, women, children that were wiped out, right, in a matter of a couple of years, right? Hundreds of years of history just totally destroyed, families devastated. And that perhaps a place that in another timeline, right, maybe I would be saying Kinos in a shul in Galicia, right? But that's not what happened. So I want to read a little bit, translate a little bit with you, and then we'll say Elit Zion, which is. And I just want to add that while Galicia, is my home country, as it were, You can substitute wherever it is that you're from also. Because it's the same story whether it's Galicia, or it's Hungary, or it's Lita, or it's Germany, or Belgium, or Holland, or Czechoslovakia, or Greece. People don't know that there is a tremendous, beautiful Greek Sephardi community that was almost totally annihilated by the Nazis, right? That put in whatever city, whatever region that this was about, right? But like imagine, and again, halavai, we should have such a storied Jewish life. Imagine the entire Jewish Midwest disappeared in 5 years. Galitzien v'yareho, k'mo isha v'tzireho, v'chivsu lo chagurasak, halval nureho, haletzvos kodesh gehaleho, for all of her holy congregations. Batei midrashot zufneseho, the Batei Medrash and the shuls. V'alvias mecharfeil b'sof mikdash, and all the blasphemers that came into her temples. All the Sifrei Torah that were destroyed. The letters flying in the air. All those who gave their lives to save the Sifrei Torah and burned alive. All the children who are in school. And all the yeshivas. Skip ahead a little bit. All the Rebbes there. All the beautiful Hasidic books, which you'd imagine Shimon Kempler assumed in 1943 were burned and nobody would ever open again. All the Jewish homes and all the generous Jews, people who live to give tzedakah. Almost those hatzdaka, the chevrosa, all of the different institutions that exist in the Jewish community for chesed, for tzedakah, for bikur cholim, for all these wonderful causes, all gone. Alei palei Yisrael, v'yad charitzeho, v'al miflagos Yisrael, le'irgunoseho. Polish Jewry had a vibrant world of different Jewish groups, different parties, different groups, right? A whole internal political communal life. All gone. The whole world of Jewish books and newspapers and literature that existed. All those were killed, were never taken to a proper burial. All the millions of people who have no kfarim for their families to go to. All the children who never sinned. The cries and prayers of Israel and their tears. All the Jewish businesses and business people and all the things that people built there. All the people who intervened for the Jewish people. Im shachar kiroseo, kol arei Galitzien, im rivivos karbonoseo. For all the blackened houses of the Jewish people and all the cities of Galicia, with the tens of thousands of their sacrifices. We'll say Alitzia.
Asher Yosef Yisachar,